Chapter 29. Working for CRO and flying solo Aero Engine Services. I began the new job in January 1970. It was quite a challenge, but I got it set up okay and it turned out a successful venture. The company, CRO named after its founder C.R. Ogden, was based in Sydney, but had outlets throughout New Zealand using local distributors. One interesting part of the job was that I needed to visit all these outlets throughout the year. This took me to every centre in the country from Kachaya in the north to Invercargill in the extreme south. My early career in sales was very successful and we had a record turnover for the year. The experience I gained was invaluable for me in a small business administration, sales and marketing, something that would turn out to be a great value later on in the aviation world. Although the complete change of work was useful, the lure of flying stayed with me, and after a year I decided to apply for an advertised sales job. Selling the Victor aircraft, now renamed the Aero series. The manufacturer of this aircraft was a New Zealand company, based in Hamilton, named Aero Engine Services Limited, which was founded and owned by a remarkable entrepreneur, Alf Coleman. Alf was an ex-Air Force and New Zealand engineer with a superb knowledge and expertise in aero engines. He began his business repairing engines in a shed and built it up to a first-class aviation facility. Later he had broadened out from aero engine repairs and overhauls to a wide spectrum of sales and service for all aircraft products. Eventually he had acquired all the plans, jigs and fixtures from the Australian company originally manufacturing the Victor. There was now a production line of Victors in the Hamilton factory and they were flown by an increasing number of flying clubs. The New Zealand government had also decided to assist in the venture and had donated a number of the newly Aero to Southeast Asian countries, under the Colombo Aid Plan. The idea being to develop a market for the aircraft overseas, and this is where I came in. The ultimate aim was to get overseas air forces and clubs to purchase the Aero as a basic trainer. Alf Coleman saw me, as a retired wing commander, with worldwide experience and recent flying with the Aero, as the man to be his sales manager. I was also a wing commander currently serving on the R.A.A.F active reserve. This had come about when I was at the Auckland Aero Club and the R.A.A.F called for ex-service officers engaged on instructional duties to join the reserve. I had, therefore, received a commission in a second Air Force at the same rank and seniority I had previously held in the R.A.A.F. I was appointed Shadow OC flying training at R.N.Z.A.F. Wigram, near Christchurch, the main basic training base for pilots and other R.N.Z.A.F. aircrew. Subsequently I went there once per year for 2 weeks refresher training, and this was an added advantage in as far as Alf Coleman was concerned. CRO was surprised that I left after such a successful, but short stay, but I don't think they understood the call of flying which had become so much a part of me. I now joined the AESL at the beginning of November 1970, and was thrown into the deep end. The aircraft to be gifted to Indonesia, Thailand and Singapore under the New Zealand aid program were soon to begin delivery. Alf wanted me to ferry the first one to Bangkok in November. I had kept up my flying as a part-time instructor with the Aero Club, but I needed to renew my instrument rating for the ferry flight to Thailand. I soon got this done in a Mooney aircraft from the Auckland Aero Club. All set with the required qualifications, I moved to Hamilton and took up my job. I managed to find digs with a very nice elderly widowed lady, Mrs. Mavis DeLuan, who had a couple of boarders. This suited me admirably as I could board during the week and travel back to Auckland at weekends. The Aero I would be ferrying was the T6 version. This was basically the same as the latest one we had acquired at the Aero Club with a 150 HP engine. The T6 was slightly different and had a 160 HP engine, due to slightly larger pistons than the 150 version. The ferry trip to Bangkok was to be quite a challenge. To ferry a small single-engined aircraft with a wingspan of only 24 feet, over a 6,000-mile route, most of it over the sea, is a test of one's courage and ability. Many people thought I was mad to take it on, especially at 48 years of age. Undaunted by these comments I went ahead, for I have never been able to resist a challenge. However, the lead up to final departure was to prove rather nerve-wracking itself. Initially the aircraft with the call sign DDE had radio problems, but the aircraft itself was fine, engine and airframe wise, and performed very well in the production tests. Apart from the problems that arose with the radio equipment. To fly under oceanic conditions it was necessary to carry serviceable basic aids and radio. The one aid fitted was a radio compass, and the radio comprised a multi-channel VHF and a makeshift HF radio. The radio compass and the VHF were normal fittings, but the HF was not. HF as a long-range radio is essential for communication on long oceanic flights. The snag arose mainly with the aerial system, which was rather a Heath Robinson affair, carrying external wires, something resembling a clothesline, slung between the wingtips and the tail section on both sides of the aircraft. After some difficulty I succeeded after numerous air tests to get radio contact with oceanic control in Auckland. The aircraft in the ferry mode, apart from the radio fit, was set up with an overload fuel tank holding 70 gallons of petrol. This was fitted into the seat next to the pilot, so the aircraft was no longer capable of carrying two pilots. I called it Hank the Tank. Space was severely restricted and it was quite a problem stowing the gear one had to take. This included survival equipment in the form of a life jacket, Mae West, which one wore all the time over the sea, a dinghy and a survival pack which the pilot sat on. No parachute was carried. The rest of the aircraft space was taken up with a large number of maps, charts and documents essential to be able to navigate. Plus the information necessary to maintain contact with the various air traffic control agencies. One had to be in radio contact at all times. Overland this was no great problem as the VHF was adequate for this requirement, but over the ocean it was mandatory to make a report once every hour to the appropriate oceanic control center in whose area you were flying. The various diplomatic clearances having been obtained, I set off from Hamilton, 56 miles south of Auckland, for Keikaya in the extreme north. Special dispensation had been given to clear customs at Hamilton, thereby avoiding calling into Auckland. The reason for going to Keikaya was to refuel, as one had to be able to carry sufficient fuel to fly from Keikaya to Norfolk Island, a distance of 450 nautical miles. Hold over Norfolk Island for 45 minutes in case of adverse weather, then return to Keikaya if one was unable to land at Norfolk. Over and above this requirement was the need for a 10% reserve on the fuel calculated for the flight time estimated. The only way the Air Tour could meet this regulation was to fly from Keikaya. The first time I set off I had to return to Hamilton from Keikaya because I could not establish HF contact with oceanic control. More work was done on the radio to get it right, and 2 days later I set off again. I encountered the same problem, so I diverted to Whangarei to try and get the radio fixed there. No joy, so back to Hamilton. A third attempt ended in failure for the same reason, despite assistance from an R.A.A.F detachment at Keikaya. Finally, on the 18th of November I got away successfully. By this time my nerves were pretty stretched after 3 abortive tries to depart. At least all the flying to Keikaya and Hamilton had settled the new engine and comfortably. On the leg from Keikaya to Norfolk the weather was good with clear visibility and only broken cloud. Outbound I planned to use the Keikaya NDB navigation direction beacon for back bearings on my radio compass, and as soon as possible I hope to pick up the NDB at Norfolk. Both NDBs gave out a strong 7 kilowatt signal. However, with only one navigation aid it was essential to keep a careful dead reckoning plot going in case the radio compass failed. I had read Sir Francis Chichester's book The Lonely Sea in the Sky, describing his early flights to Norfolk Island and across the Tasman and the method of navigation he employed to fly over long stretches of ocean. This method was to take into account the forecast winds and to estimate the probable error in the event of a wind change. By using this system and laying a course for a likely error, you could be pretty certain which way to head to search for Norfolk Island if you did not find it on ETA. I set my heading accordingly and kept plotting the bearings I got from Keikaya. Fortunately, soon after I left Keikaya, the Norfolk NDB came up clear and strong when I tuned into its frequency. Further on I was able to plot cross bearings from Lord Howe Island several hundred miles to the south, which gave me ground speed calculations. The aircraft was slow in airspeed at first, due to the heavier than normal all-up weight, which meant that after climbing to 5,000 feet, At that level I could only get an indicated airspeed of 90 knots as the fuel burned off and the aircraft got lighter. This improved to an IAS of 105 knots fortunately. I had a slight tailwind which gave me a ground speed of around 115 to 220 knots. Special dispensation had been given to fly the aircraft at 200 pounds overweight, in order to carry the extra fuel. In all I had about 10 hours fuel, so provided the weather at Norfolk was okay there would be plenty of fuel. The engine was purring smoothly and the weather conditions were good. Flying a long oceanic leg in a single-engined aircraft for the first time certainly kept me alert. I recalled the old R.A.F. navigation manual motto, external vigilance is the price of safety. I sure keep vigilant. I did have trouble keeping HF radio contact with Auckland, but fortunately Fiji Oceanic heard me and relayed my messages. I also got help from a passing civil airliner high up at 30,000 feet who helped pass my reports to Sydney. The Norfolk NDB was now easy to follow, and when about 30 minutes out I established VHF radio contact with Norfolk Island Air Traffic Control. So after 4 hours in the air I could relax a little. Finally, I spotted the island about 20 miles out and this made me feel quite elated. It was the first time I had experienced this wonderful feeling at the end of a long sea crossing in a single-engined aircraft. I have now some idea of what the early pioneers had gone through, but they had done it all without modern aids. I picked out Phillip Island at the southern tip of Norfolk Island and then spotted the airport, which in those days it was only a grass surface. The control tower gave me permission to land and I joined downwind for the grass strip to land to the east. It was with pleasure and relief that I touched down and taxied in. I went through the immigration and customs formalities and then set about refueling the aircraft. Planning to make an early start for the long 790-mile haul to Brisbane at first light the next day. After securing the aircraft I arranged a room at a local motel. It was only around lunchtime so I could enjoy a beer, lunch and a relaxed afternoon. I did a preliminary check on the forecast for the next day and it was not looking too good. A low pressure area was moving across the Tasman and would lie across my route to Brisbane. The weather was good at Norfolk so I decided to worry about the next day when it arrived. I put in a call to Alf Coleman in Hamilton and he was very relieved to learn that all was well, especially after all the difficulties I had experienced with the radio earlier. He let Gladys know I was okay, which he always did for me on the other flights of this nature in the future. I got up at 4 AM the next morning still hoping to get off at first light. The weather at Norfolk was reasonable, but when I got my weather forecast from the Met office, I got a poor outlook for the long 790 nautical mile leg to Brisbane. I delayed as long as I could in the hope of an improvement, but then a message was received from Sydney Control Centre and strongly advising me not to attempt to fly to Brisbane that day. That made my decision for me and I delayed my departure until the next day. I took advantage of the delay, hiring a rental car to do some sightseeing. Norfolk Island is a delightful place with lush countryside and excellent sea views all round its coast. The formal penal settlement is steeped in colonial history, with the former old buildings from these early days still in good condition. It was a harsh place for the convicts from Australia to be sent and the hardships they must have endured were quite evident. I was intrigued to find the highest mountain was named Mount Bates, after the surveyor who discovered it. The next morning I received a favorable weather forecast, not perfect, but flyable, so I flight planned and took off early in the early morning sunrise, a most lovely and peaceful scene. The flight to Brisbane would take just over 8 hours on the flight plan, indeed a long trip. I had ordered some fruit and sandwiches and cans of fruit juice. To overcome the normal problems of a personal major, I leave the reader to guess what the last thing I did before climbing into the aircraft. By only taking a short drink every hour for the main part of the flight I was able to avoid the need to spend pennies en route, with the reward a good long drink about an hour out from destinations. Initially, I climbed up to 5,000 feet and although it was generally cloudy, the weather at that level was okay. Further along I found it getting cloudier and rougher and so I descended to a lower level. With help from passing aircraft up higher I was able to get my hourly reports through to, first, Fiji and then Sydney. I was now down to about 2,000 feet and at that height it was clear of cloud. I was able to read wind lanes accurately, learned during my days at Coastal Command. By this method I could assess a wind within 5 degrees in direction and 5 knots in speed. Accurate enough to give warning of any major wind change and enable early corrections of heading to be made to compensate. The weather was getting worse and I ended up at 500 feet for a couple of hours. Pretty intimidating stuff in a single-engine aircraft over the lonely vastness of the Tasman, when even the slightest hiccup of the engine would have been very alarming at that height. Fortunately the aircraft was purring along, aided by what was now 35-knot tailwind, being just what the doctor ordered. I picked up the Brisbane NDB and felt safer homing in on that. Then I made VHF contact with Brisbane Control and I knew all was well. The wind advantage had enabled me to gain time and I reached Brisbane in 7.5 hours, a really good time. I saw my first ship, throughout the whole Tasman crossing, about 10 miles off the Brisbane coast. I crossed the coast only a mile or so south of track and gratefully landed at Brisbane Airport, quite delighted at my first solo Tasman Sea crossing being completed successfully. The next 2 legs would be long hauls over the Australian outback, first to Mount Isa and then to Darwin. After a night's rest at a nearby motel I carried out all the formalities and pre-flight checks on the aircraft. It was around 7 AM when I set off and, although quite early, it was already hot and humid. These 2 factors, plus a build-up of cloud over the hills to the north of Brisbane, did give me a few initial problems. Aircraft engines, especially the piston variety, did not perform at their best in hot, humid conditions. Coupled with this, I had an aircraft that was fully laden and above its normal maximum all-up weight. I was really making a climb rate of 200 feet per minute and this was hardly enough to climb to the maximum safe altitude to clear the hills en route. The cloud would also not help if I got into turbulence. Initially I had filed an instrument flight plan, but I cancelled this and decided to fly visual. This enabled me to stay below the cloud base and to map read my way over the hills. Gradually, I made my way, gaining significant height to clear both the hills and steer clear of the cloud. Once away from the hills, the weather improved to be one of just small clouds and good visibility. I managed to get up to 5,000 feet and remain in visual contact with the ground, a height which was enough to provide reasonably cool conditions in the increasing morning temperatures. The rest of the flight was uneventful with little to see except the scrub of the Australian desert, burnt and arid, but punctuated from time to time by small outback homesteads in their lonely isolation. I got good NDB coverage from the various airports and towns along the route, which were within range. My HF was no longer a problem as it had been over the sea, as I was able to send my required position reports by VHF under the relay station system which exists even in the remoter parts of the outback. Whilst I had flown extensively over Australia and Canberra, it was my first chance to really study the outback at slow speed and at low level. My cruising speed was only 90 knots until I burnt off fuel, then it gradually rose to around 110 knots. The winds were light and variable and neither help nor hindrance to my progress. Mount Isa radio came into range and I gave my ETA, finally receiving the necessary clearance to land. Mount Isa is a sizable town despite its remoteness, a product of Australia's rich natural resources in mining ore, bauxite and other precious metals. Having settled the aircraft, refueling and picketing it against any strong overnight winds, I set off for the town. The flight had taken 7.5 hours and, even over the desert and good weather, it had been rather bumpy due to hot air currents. With no autopilot, flying manually and solo over such a long time is very tiring, so I was going to shower and freshen up with a well-deserved beer at the hotel I booked into. I took a walk into town and looked around the well-filled shops. At this time the mining boom in Australia was still in full swing and there was no shortage of money in a town like Mount Isa. My second day over the Australian outback would bring a change of terrain from scrub to the Great Red Hills towards the northwest. I made Tennant Creek some 200 miles from Mount Isa, but from here on the navigation became difficult as I ran out of NDB coverage. The terrain was pretty featureless and there were no sea wind lanes to help this time. The one thing I did not want to do was drift away to the northeast towards the Simpson Desert. Gradually I had a gut feeling that the wind had changed after I crossed a range of low hills, so I decided to make a 30-degree alteration of heading to the west. This would take me towards the one and only road and rail link along the Birdsville track to Darwin. Once I hit that landmark, all they had to do was follow the rail and road to Darwin. It turned out to be a wise decision, because when I intercepted the railway line, I knew my former heading would never have got me to Darwin. I was quite relieved as I just flew along what pilots call the iron compass, namely, the railway. The scenery began to change from desert scrub to bush and jungle as I neared Darwin. 100 miles south I flew over the big R.A.A.F base at Winton. 1 hour later I landed at Darwin Airport, after 6.5 hours in the air. The aircraft was still performing very well, as it would need to do for the crossing of the dreaded Timor Sea on the next leg. The next leg was to be the longest of the whole route, 903 nautical miles from Darwin to Bali. The Darwin Aero Club members proved most helpful and allowed me to park my aircraft in the area and use their facilities to refuel. On reporting to air traffic control and filing a flight plan for the next day, I suffered a setback when I was informed that my diplomatic clearance to fly across Indonesia had not come through. They contacted Jakarta and advised them that it had been previously approved. Bureaucracy in Indonesia is rife, so I should not have been too surprised. After some delay I got through to the New Zealand embassy in Jakarta and they got working to get the clearance. Meanwhile all I could do was wait. The Aero Club member who helped me with the aircraft told me he had an English pilot staying with him who had a problem. Apparently, this pilot had been delivering a Britten-Norman Islander aircraft after flying from UK to Darwin. On arrival in Darwin he had been found to have a packet of drugs secreted in an inspection point on the outside of the fuselage. He had protested his innocence, saying that he was sure it had been planted on the aircraft without his knowledge. He was to be charged in an Aussie court, but was out on bail and staying with the Aero Club member. I was asked if I would like to meet him and I agreed. The pilot in trouble turned out to be an ex-R.A.A.F officer I knew, a wartime Polish pilot who had settled in UK and whom I had known in Singapore. After hearing his story I was convinced that he was innocent. Apparently, he had been approached in Bangkok and offered cash to carry drugs, but he refused. He had been warned that he would be sorry if he didn't carry the package. Later the package he was caught with had been planted on his aircraft without his knowledge and the Darwin police advised accordingly, subsequently arresting and charging him. The next day my diplomatic clearance had not come through, so I had to delay 24 hours. I spent the day looking around Darwin and visiting the rather sad Polish chapter. He was not sure at all that he would get off a long prison sentence, as the Aussies were tough on drug smugglers. Britain-Norman were working hard on his behalf from UK. It certainly served as a warning to me to watch out for something similar happening to me, as I transited through Asian airports. I was pleased to learn some time later that he was acquitted. The day was not wasted as far as planning my next route. The pilot in trouble had given me a lot of useful information on the route to Bangkok, for he was a professional ferry pilot for Britain-Norman and has flown the route often before. The most difficult part of the next leg was the 400-mile Timor Sea crossing to East Timor. Not listed were several NDBS on oil rigs and I got the frequency and call sign of these. They were out to over 100 miles off the northern Australian coast and would give very useful cross bearings as a ground speed check on the first half of the crossing. Fortunately, later that day, after more calls to Jakarta, I received my clearance to fly to Bali and Jakarta. Weather can be a real problem over the Timor Sea and Indonesian waters, but I was lucky and had a good forecast for Bali. I got a nice early start, getting off just after first light. The morning was clear and with no hills to get over I climbed slowly out of Darwin and out over the Timor Sea. One thing about flying a single-engined aircraft over the sea, the engine doesn't know it's over the water. Even a slight stutter of your one and only engine can give you a fright when you are over water and out of sight of land, especially over shark-infested waters such as the Timor Sea. The NDB from Darwin is very powerful and I hoped I would be able to get bearings from it until I could pick up the NDB at Kupang Airport, on Timor. The local people there I learned had a nasty habit of switching it off when they had no Indonesian airlines operating from Kupang. I must have been lucky because it was on when I tuned it in. The weather was good and I picked out large banks of cloud covering the East Timor mountainous coast. Later I sighted the mountains and coast and happily I crossed the southeastern tip of Timor. The rest of the route was pretty straightforward provided the weather held. A string of islands lay along the route to Bali, which were distinctive in size and shape, making navigation pretty easy. The southern Indonesian islands lay to my right, and I picked up the coast and flew into Tuban Airport at Bali, after a flight of 8.25 hours. I had not found it too hard, hot yes, but, after the Timor crossing, fairly relaxing just looking down at the various islands. I booked into the lovely Bali Beach Hotel for the night, but, what I hadn't realized was that the last time I traveled from the airport to the hotel, I had done so in a fast-moving motorcade. A local taxi ride was a different kettle of fish. It seemed to take ages to get to the hotel, and the next morning when I was anxious to get away, even more so. It was going to be a long day, for I planned to go to Jakarta to refuel and then go straight on to Singapore. The flight around to the eastern Java coast was no problem, and I flew partly over the land in the sea on a 5.5-hour flight to Jakarta. All would have been well had I not been hampered by bureaucratic delays by the Indonesian authorities at the airport. Immigration, customs, air traffic and refueling agencies all held me up. Most were looking for backhanders as well. The last straw was just as I was taxiing out for the leg to Singapore. One of the Indonesian ground people threatened to break my HF aerial if I didn't pay him $10 US. In exasperation, I threw him a note, expressing my view on his parentage as I did. Because of all the delays, I could not now reach Singapore before dark. I had hoped to avoid a night flight on this route, but it was not to be. Fortunately, I knew Singapore well and also its high quality of air traffic control, so I had decided to press on. It got dark about an hour out of Singapore, and this leg had to be flown under instrument conditions. It got dark and cloudy towards Singapore, and I flew the last part in and out of cloud. Singapore radar picked me up okay and steered me clear of some thunderstorm activity, and eventually I landed at Paya Lebar after 4 hours, a very tired pilot. It had been a never-ending day, and after having arranged parking at the Aero Club tarmac, I thankfully booked into a hotel in nearby Katong. I phoned Sir Rochford Hughes to let him know I was in Singapore, for he had been very helpful in assisting us to promote the air tour. It was nice to talk to him and Lady Hughes again after several years' break. I was off to Bangkok the next day, so I did not see them that night, but they invited me to stay with them on my way back. The next morning, still weary and a bit jaded after the past few days, I set off on the final leg of this saga. It was to be a fairly straightforward route up the east coast of Malaya and across the Bay of Thailand to Bangkok. Unfortunately, there was low cloud up the east coast, but I found a good gap between the layers and used the many good NDBS to navigate up the coast. It cleared along the Isthmus and I flew into Bangkok in good weather after an 8-hour flight. The friendly American voice from the air traffic control tower was very welcome. There was quite a gathering of officials to meet me, including the New Zealand ambassador, along with senior Thai officials. I was now able to relax and enjoy the celebratory champagne on offer. It was an historic flight, both for me and New Zealand, and I felt on top of the world. The total journey had taken 55 hours of flying over 7 days and in arduous conditions. The aircraft had performed magnificently and was a tribute to New Zealand aviation. The next few days was spent on stripping the aircraft of its ferry equipment, which had to be air freighted back urgently to New Zealand for the next delivery. I was afforded magnificent hospitality by the local agents, the embassy staff and the Thai aviation people. The first night I was taken out to dinner and the first course on the menu was shark's fin soup. My hosts were puzzled when I laughed, but they saw the joke when I told them I had spent the last 7 days hoping to avoid being eaten by sharks. And then I was now delighted to be eating the shark instead. They regularly told that story wherever we went afterwards. It was not possible to give a flight in the aircraft to the CFI of the school the aircraft was going to, as the usual bureaucracy was going to take ages to get the necessary certificate of airworthiness. He was quite happy to fly the aircraft when it became ready, following a ground briefing for me. I flew a civil airline from Bangkok after the few hectic days there, which had included press interviews and other promotions. Bangkok really appealed to me, and I am glad to relate that I would get to know it very well indeed later on. Air Marshal Sir Rochford and Elizabeth Hughes made me very welcome in Singapore, and I enjoyed a very pleasant weekend at their lovely residence overlooking Keppel Harbour. I even had a game of golf at the Royal Singapore Golf Club with Elizabeth. Finally, I returned to Auckland after what had been a very worthwhile and adventurous couple of weeks. My confidence was boosted by the recent flight and I felt I had touched close to the aviation pioneers who had made history over the route I had flown. It remains one of the highlights of my career in aviation. It was great to be home and be greeted by Gladys. It had obviously been a worrying time for her as well.